In the last weeks of November 1950, in the mountains of North Korea, the thermometer plunged to 35 degrees below zero. Ice formed on rifle bolts. Morphine syrettes froze solid in medic bags. Blood plasma turned to slush. And 15,000 men of the 1st Marine Division, along with elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division, found themselves surrounded by 10 divisions of Chinese troops in terrain so brutal that frostbite became as deadly an enemy as bullets. This is the story of the Chosin Reservoir, a battle that would become legendary in Marine Corps history, a fighting retreat so fierce that one commander famously declared, "Retreat, hell, we're just attacking in a different direction." But to understand what happened in those frozen mountains, we need to go back to how these men ended up there in the first place. The Korean War had begun just 5 months earlier, in June 1950, when North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel. By September, UN forces under General Douglas MacArthur had turned the tide with the audacious Incheon landing. The North Korean army collapsed, Seoul was liberated, and suddenly the war seemed all but won. MacArthur's forces pushed north, racing toward the Yalu River, the border with China. The general assured Washington that Chinese intervention was unlikely. Intelligence suggested otherwise, but MacArthur's confidence was infectious. There was talk that American troops would be home by Christmas. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Oliver P. Smith, advanced up the eastern side of the Korean peninsula toward the Chosin Reservoir, a man-made lake in the Taebaek Mountains. General Smith was methodical, careful, some said too careful. While other units raced northward, Smith insisted on building supply dumps, improving the single narrow road that connected his forces to the port of Hungnam on the coast, and maintaining tactical cohesion. His caution would save thousands of lives. The terrain itself was forbidding. Korea's northeastern mountains rose in jagged peaks, cut by deep valleys. The main supply route, MSR, was little more than a dirt track that wound through mountain passes, hugging cliff edges with drops of hundreds of feet. In places it was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, and then there was the cold. Marines who'd fought across the Pacific in World War II had never experienced anything like it. The Siberian wind that howled down from Manchuria didn't just chill, it attacked. Men who'd survived Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima found themselves defeated by the simple act of trying to urinate without getting frostbite. Weapons froze. Vehicle engines had to be run continuously, or they'd never start again. Sea rations were so frozen they had to be thawed with body heat or broken apart with bayonets. By late November, the Marines were stretched along 80 miles of mountain road. The 5th and 7th Marine Regiments were concentrated around Udamni, a village at the western edge of the reservoir. Further south, at Hagaru-ri, General Smith established his forward headquarters. Still further down the MSR, at Koto-ri and then Chinheung-ni, more Marine and Army units secured the vital supply line. They were dangerously dispersed, and they were not alone in those mountains. On the night of November 27, 1950, the temperature dropped to 25 below zero. At Udamni, Marines huddled in their sleeping bags, trying to steal a few hours of rest. Some units were still moving into position for an attack scheduled for the next morning, an attack that would never happen. Just after 10 p.m., the bugles began, Chinese bugles echoing across the frozen valleys, and then from seemingly every direction at once, they came. The 9th Army Group of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, 12 divisions, over 150,000 men, had been waiting in those mountains for weeks, concealed during daylight, moving only at night. They'd been there all along, watching, freezing, preparing. Now they struck with overwhelming force. The Chinese tactics were unlike anything the Marines had encountered. They attacked in human waves, often at night, using bugles and whistles to coordinate movement and create psychological terror. They sought to infiltrate between positions, to surround and isolate units, to create chaos. Many were poorly equipped, some without winter clothing, some without adequate weapons, but they came with ferocious determination. At Udam-ni, Fox Company of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, held a critical position at Toktong Pass, along the MSR between Udam-ni and Hagaru-ri. Captain William Barber commanded 240 men on a rocky hill overlooking the road. When the Chinese attack came, it came at Fox Company with special fury. Wave after wave of Chinese infantry charged up that hill. The fighting was close, brutal, often hand to hand. Grenades arced through the darkness. The Americans fired until their rifle barrels glowed red. When men fell wounded, the cold began killing them almost immediately. Captain Barber was hit in the hip by grenade fragments, but refused evacuation. For 5 days and nights, Fox Company would hold that hill against a force that sometimes outnumbered them 10 to 1. They held because that road was the only way out for 8,000 Marines trapped further north. They held because leaving meant dying. They held because that's what Marines do. Further north at Udam-ni, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis and his 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, found themselves cut off from the main body of Marines. The Chinese had seized portions of the MSR. The trap was closing. At Hagaru-ri, General Smith received the reports with growing alarm. His division was fractured, surrounded, under attack from multiple directions. The army units on the east side of the reservoir, Task Force Faith, were being decimated. The Chinese were pressing in on all sides. Some commanders might have panicked. Smith did not. He immediately ordered his scattered forces to consolidate. The Marines at Udam-ni would fight their way south to Hagaru-ri. There, behind a hastily constructed perimeter, engineers were carving an airstrip out of the frozen ground, an airstrip that would become the difference between survival and annihilation. The breakout from Udam-ni began on December 1st. It was not a retreat, at least not in any conventional sense. Every yard of that 14-mile road to Hagaru-ri would have to be fought for. The Chinese held the high ground. They'd established roadblocks. They occupied the hills on both sides of the MSR. The Marines would have to attack continuously in sub-zero temperatures while bringing out their wounded, their equipment, and their dead. Lieutenant Colonel Davis volunteered to lead a relief force over the mountains to reach Fox Company at Toktong Pass. It was a desperate gambit, taking a battalion off the MSR, over frozen ridges in darkness, through Chinese positions, but it was Fox Company's only hope. Davis led his men out in the afternoon of December 1st. They climbed in single file, each man following the man in front through snow sometimes waist deep. When they encountered Chinese positions, they attacked with bayonets fixed, trying to maintain silence, knowing that every firefight would draw more enemy forces. It took them 18 hours of continuous movement to cover the few miles to Fox Company's position. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Frostbite was epidemic, but when they reached Captain Barber's beleaguered company on the morning of December 2nd, the Chinese offensive in that sector broke. The road remained open. Davis would receive the Medal of Honor, so would Captain Barber. But as Davis himself would later say, every man who made that march deserved it. On the MSR itself, the fighting was continuous and savage. Chinese forces occupied hills overlooking every turn in the road. Each hill had to be taken by frontal assault, often in broad daylight, with men struggling through snow and ice while under fire. Artillery support was limited. Shells had to be rationed. Air support was sporadic, dependent on weather that was often too foul for flying. The Marines developed a rhythm of attack. Infantry would assault the heights, while other units moved the convoy forward. When one hill was secured, they'd move to the next. Sometimes they'd have to take the same hill twice when Chinese forces reoccupied it after dark. The wounded presented an agonizing problem. Normally, casualties would be evacuated to rear areas, but there were no rear areas. Everything was the front line. The wounded rode in trucks, packed together for warmth. Those who couldn't fit in trucks were strapped to the hoods of vehicles, covered with tarps. Some died of their wounds, others died of the cold. The Marines brought them all out anyway. Equipment that broke or ran out of fuel was destroyed to keep it from Chinese hands. Ammunition was husbanded carefully. Food became secondary. Staying warm and staying alive were all that mattered. And then there were moments of almost unbearable poignancy. A Marine sharing his last cigarette with a wounded buddy, a corpsman giving his own gloves to a soldier with frostbitten hands, knowing his own fingers would pay the price. Men carrying wounded comrades on their backs for miles because there was no other way. By December 4th, the Marines from Udamni had reached Hagaru-ri. They'd covered 14 miles in 4 days. They'd killed thousands of Chinese soldiers. They'd suffered over 1,500 casualties themselves, but they'd made it. At Hagaru-ri, the miracle of the airstrip was in full swing. Marine engineers, working under fire, had somehow carved out a runway from frozen ground using picks, dynamite, and sheer determination. C-47 transport planes began landing, bringing in supplies and taking out the most seriously wounded. Over the next few days, more than 4,000 casualties would be evacuated by air from that crude strip. It was only 3,600 feet long, barely adequate, but those pilots came in anyway, often under fire, knowing that each flight meant lives saved. But Hagaru-ri was not safety. It was merely a way station. The Marines still had 38 miles to go to reach the coast at Hungnam, and every mile of that road was contested. On December 6th, the breakout from Hagaru-ri began. Now the entire 1st Marine Division was moving together, a column of vehicles and men that stretched for miles. The Chinese had reinforcements. They knew the route, and they were determined that the Americans would not escape. The most dangerous section lay at Funchilin Pass, where the road crossed a gorge on a concrete bridge. Chinese demolition teams had destroyed a section of the bridge. Without it, the entire column would be trapped. Air Force Combat Cargo Command flew in 8 sections of portable bridge, treadway bridge sections, each weighing 2,500 pounds. In one of the war's most audacious engineering feats, the bridge sections were parachuted into Koto-ri. Engineers then hauled them by truck to the gap, assembled them under fire, and created a span that could support tanks. The column drove across, tanks, trucks loaded with wounded, artillery pieces. On December 9th, the first elements of the Marine Division crossed that improvised bridge. Behind them, engineers prepared demolition charges. The last Marine across would blow the bridge, denying it to the Chinese forever. But the Chinese weren't finished. They attacked the column continuously, especially at night. Roadblocks appeared and had to be cleared. Ambushes erupted from the hills. The temperature remained brutally cold. Among the army units that had been decimated east of the reservoir, the survivors were integrated into Marine units. Task Force Faith had been virtually destroyed, its commander killed. The soldiers who made it out often spoke with awe of the Marines' discipline under fire, their refusal to abandon equipment or casualties, their grim determination to fight their way out rather than surrender. There were acts of individual heroism almost too numerous to count. Private Hector Cafarata, fighting at Fox Company's position, killed over a dozen Chinese soldiers in close combat, at one point picking up Chinese grenades and throwing them back before they could explode, until one went off in his hand, blowing off his fingers. He survived and received the Medal of Honor. Navy Corpsman William Charette treated wounded Marines while under fire for 3 days straight, eventually earning the Medal of Honor for refusing to leave casualties behind. Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, commanding the Army's Task Force Faith, fought with savage determination to save his men until he was mortally wounded. He would receive a posthumous Medal of of Honor. The list goes on. 14 medals of honor would be awarded for actions at Chosin, the most for any single battle in the Korean War. By December 11th, the last Marines reached Hungnam. They'd fought for 2 weeks straight in the worst conditions imaginable. They'd inflicted devastating casualties on Chinese forces. Estimates range from 25,000 to 40,000 Chinese dead or wounded, but the cost had been high. The Marines suffered over 700 killed in action and over 3,500 wounded. Frostbite casualties exceeded 7,000. When reporters asked Major General Smith about the retreat from Chosin, he bristled at the word. His reply became legendary. "Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating. We're just advancing in a different direction." It wasn't just bravado. The 1st Marine Division had entered the Chosin Reservoir as a fighting force and emerged as a fighting force. They'd brought out their wounded, their equipment, even their dead. They'd destroyed 7 Chinese divisions in the process. And they'd proven something fundamental about the human spirit, that training, leadership, and unit cohesion can overcome even the most desperate circumstances. The Chosin Reservoir marked the turning point of the Korean War. MacArthur's dream of quick victory died in those mountains. The war would settle into a brutal stalemate that would last another 2.5 years. But the Marines' stand at Chosin demonstrated that UN forces could not be defeated in detail, could not be panicked into collapse. Today, survivors of Chosin, now in their 90s or passed on, are known as the Chosin Few. They gather annually, fewer each year, to remember the comrades they left behind in those frozen mountains. They remember Fox Company's stand. They remember the breakout from Udumni. They remember the cold. And they remember that when everything seemed lost, when surrounded by overwhelming numbers in terrain that seemed designed for death itself, they did not break. They did not surrender. They fought their way out, brought their brothers with them, and wrote one of the most epic chapters in military history, the Chosin Reservoir, where the frozen Chosin proved that courage doesn't freeze, even when everything else does.